Welcome to Pen to Pod. This week we are doing a solo episode with me where I will be diving into an aspect of writing craft. For the month of October, we will be talking about writer's voice, and this episode will have me sharing insights from others, reading excerpts from short stories, and having my own thoughts about writer's voice. If you haven't already, go ahead and give us a follow wherever you are listening to this podcast, or go ahead and subscribe to my YouTube channel at Mick Writes. Let's dive in. Two weeks ago, I talked about what voice is. I shared some examples of voice from short stories and gave some writing examples to help you find your own unique voice. Today, we are going to talk about how voice affects the tone of your piece. Since it's spooky season, I thought it would be fun to use some examples from the short story collection titled Vampires Never Get Old, Tales with Fresh Bite, edited by Zoraida Cordova and Natalie C. Parker. If you haven't read the short story collection yet, I highly recommend you do so. One advice I had last time about voice was to read as much as possible. Short stories are a great way to read a lot and be able to study certain writing craft aspects quicker than you can with a novel. This short story collection has writing from multiple authors, which allows us to compare voice and tone between different writers while they write about the same thing, vampires, which don't we all love vampires? If voice is the author and the character coming alive on the page, tone is the attitude or mood they have. Tone equals attitude, whereas voice equals personality. They both come together to create your writing style. Today, we're really going to hone in on tone. So, what is tone? Tone in writing, like I said, is the attitude or mood that an author conveys through their word choice, sentence structure, and punctuation. Tone typically refers to the mood implied by an author's language and word choice, or to the way that the text can make a reader feel. Think about the difference between a cozy mystery versus a dark mystery. Both of these are in the mystery genre, but these subgenres still have genre expectations that voice and tone can help fulfill. Both stories would have a mystery to solve, of course, but in a cozy mystery, you're expecting a more heartwarming tale, so maybe a more playful or comedic tone with some quirky characters. Whereas a darker mystery might have a more serious protagonist, like an investigator, with the sense of real danger coming for them, so more eerie and moody and dark. So how do you find the correct tone for your work? First, it's best to answer some questions for yourself about your piece. 1. Why am I writing this story? 2. Who is this story for? 3. What do I want the reader to think about? And 4. How do I want the reader to feel? After answering these questions, try to come up with 1 to 2, maybe 3 words to describe your tone. Let's look at my writing project for an example. If you don't know, I'm currently writing the first draft of my project called House of Stone, where I talk about writing updates on my YouTube channel at Mick Writes. So let's dive into these questions. The first one is, why am I writing this story? Well, I'm personally writing my story because it has pieces of me in the characters, very personal pieces, and it's a story about how far people will go to feel like they belong, right? That's really my why for the story. Your why can also correlate to the theme of your story, but that's for another episode. So who is my story for? Well, my project is an adult urban fantasy, so it is for adults, and I like to say that it's for adults who loved books like City of Bones when they were younger and gravitate toward books like Ninth House and Jade City as adults. What do I want the reader to think about when reading my story? so many things. I talk about a lot of different heavy topics in my book, so just listing off some things that I want my reader to think about are things like mental health and anxiety, generational trauma and legacy, culture and language and how it dissipates with every generation of immigrant families, communities preying on our most basic human need, and friendship. So, with all of that going on and so many things to think about, how do I want my reader to feel when they're thinking about these things? I took quite some time to kind of answer this, and it really comes down to I want my reader to go on the journey of my main character. I want every reader to feel how my main character, Helen, feels, which is a lot of emotions. I want my reader to feel everything she does and have an emotional response to her actions. So this story that I'm writing, it does have a lot of nuance where my characters don't really always make the best decisions, and there's a lot of heavy topics, like I said, happening. I wouldn't describe my book as dark, though, because that would change what my tonal words would be. Since it is an adult urban fantasy, meaning it's set in the real world, but it has magic, I think one tonal word that sticks out to me would be atmospheric, or another word for atmospheric could be moody. For how I want my readers to feel, my answer is basically I want them to feel everything. My main character goes on a roller coaster of emotions, and I want my readers on that journey. So I could also use the word ardent to describe my story, which could also mean emotional. And lastly, since this book is covering heavy topics and it's for adult readers, and I want to do these justice while really allowing my readers to reflect and think about these things, I would also say I want this book to feel literary. You don't have to come up with 3 tonal words. In fact, I think 1 is probably best, but I came up with 3, and the 3 for my piece are atmospheric, ardent, and literary. Tone, just like voice, is best done in line editing, since tone really all comes down to word choice. This can still be achieved in the drafting stage, but already for my own project in House of Stone, I have notes in the margins of my Scrivener pages that say things like, make this more moody or make this more emotional. This can all be achieved by word choice and sentence structure. So let's look at some examples of tone in the Vampires Never Get Old collection. We are first going to look at the short story, The Boys from Blood River by Rebecca Roanhorse, which is actually the first short story in the Vampires Never Get Old collection. This short story is ultimately about a teenage boy named Lucas. The short story opens with Lucas and his kind of friend, Nevaeh, alone in a diner talking about the myth of the boys from Blood River. Nevaeh thinks it's a ridiculous myth and just a tale, whereas Lucas takes it seriously but doesn't want to embarrass himself in front of Nevaeh. Nevaeh tries to play one of her favorite songs off of the old jukebox, but a different song begins to play. The one where they say if you sing it, the boys from Blood River will come. They both panic, thinking it's some sort of prank, and the opening scenes really set the tone for this short story. It's tense but slightly playful, shifting from lighthearted banter to this underlying sense of urgency and unease. So I picked 2 tonal words for this story, the first being anxious. We as readers don't know if the boys from Blood River are true, but since it's a vampire story and the boys are supposedly bloodsuckers, we're kind of expecting it to come true, right? But we don't know, so this just adds to that unease and anxiety. Another tone that is coming across is juvenile or playful. Our main character is a teen, and this is a collection of young adult stories. But the opening scene truly feels like kind of a teen horror movie where they just can't tell if they're being pranked by friends or if there's a real danger they need to fear. Let's go ahead and read an excerpt. Just as a reminder, this short story is told from first-person point of view from our main character, Lucas. I didn't do it, I protest, laughing. You did it. If anyone's playing around, it's you. Well, you make it stop. Her voice rises, panicky, and I realize she's serious. I drop the mop, letting it clatter to the floor, and take 3 quick steps so I'm close enough to reach around the back of the jukebox and hit the emergency off button. For a minute, I think it's not going to shut off. Like we're in some horror movie and the thing has a life of its own, but sure enough, the machine cuts off just like it's supposed to. Silence rushes in. Okay, so anxious and juvenile or playful. But where do we feel that anxious tone? I feel it in phrases like, her voice rises, panicky, and I realize she's serious. And my favorite of this excerpt, silence rushes in. The word choice of panicky is an obvious way to describe anxious, but also the use of our character saying, and I realize she's serious, it kind of has that oh shit moment where Lucas then acts suddenly with, I drop the mop, letting it clatter to the floor and take 3 quick steps. The realization that this is serious and immediate action is an anxious movement, right? He instantly is like, oh crap, okay, and moves into panic mode. Another anxious word that is used is to describe the silence. Silence rushes in. It didn't seep in, it didn't envelop around them, it rushed in, hurried, panicky. Where do we feel the juvenile tone? You know, a lot of this, haha, should we be laughing, teen horror movie vibe is given to us through dialogue and our main character's thoughts. In this excerpt, he protests that he did not play the song, while also laughing, which adds that lighthearted and playful tone to the scene. He also says, for a minute, I think it's not going to shut off. Like we're in some horror movie and the thing has a life of its own. But sure enough, the machine cuts off just like it's supposed to. 1, he's acknowledging this horror movie-like experience, which is kind of meta-ish in a way, but then it cuts off and we get that phew moment. This playful tone also comes across in the like we're in some horror movie comment. The tone of that is kind of, can you believe this is happening? Totally crazy, you know? Let's say we wanted this short story to be darker instead. Let's hear what that would look like. Right now we have, for a minute, I think it's not going to shut off. Like we're in some horror movie and the thing has a life of its own, but sure enough, the machine cuts off just like it's supposed to. Silence rushes in. But what if it was, for a heartbeat, it feels like it might resist, as if it's trapped in some dark loop. But then it finally stops, and an uneasy silence envelops us. Do you hear the difference? So you have for a minute versus for a heartbeat. You know, for a heartbeat kind of ramps up that tension. You also then have the thing has a life of its own versus trapped in some dark loop. The connotation of being trapped does feel darker than first calling the jukebox a thing, and that it has a life of its own does add to that playful notion. You know, I'm thinking of inanimate objects coming to life, like a story like Toy Story. And then you also have, sure enough, the machine cuts off just like it's supposed to, versus, but then it finally stops, which is shorter, quicker, and adds to the intensity, whereas Roan Horse is doing exactly what they were supposed to do in this, sure enough, the machine cuts off just like it's supposed to. That leans into, like I said, that phew moment, the ramped up anxiety that Lucas has. And then once something happens, just like it's supposed to, he's like, ooh, okay, thank goodness. You know, we aren't in a horror movie. Roan Horse does such a good job of teetering between the two tones of playful and anxious, playful and anxious. And that line right there is such a good example. You also have my favorite line of silence rushes in versus an uneasy silence envelops us, which is just a typical way to say silence consuming you. And it is a little bit darker, but Roan Horse was very particular in her word choice of silence rushes in. And I think it does exactly what she wants it to do. Let's look at another excerpt from the same scene. The scene starts with Nevaeh talking. I just told you that if you sing the song, those freaks are supposed to appear, and then you play it? Don't you think that's a little much? I told you I didn't do it. Well, somebody did. A shadow passes by the window. Something's out there, moving through the parking lot. Probably a raccoon or a skunk, but bigger. Probably Brandon, Nevaeh mutters. In the parking lot? What? No. It was probably Brandon who set up the song. She peers out the big front windows. What do you mean in the parking lot? Nothing. Just thought I saw animals in the trash. Maybe it was Brandon. Scaring the shit out of us would be his idea of fun. But still, how would he have set it up beforehand? And Landry would never go for that sort of thing. She's pretty uptight about the jukebox. I want to go home, Nevaeh says, thrusting her hands in her hoodie pockets. This is all too much. I sigh. I want to go home too. The night feels sour now, as if the joke's on us and we're not in on it. This excerpt is another great example of that teen horror movie-esque tone I was referring to. It's really all in the word choice. So Nevaeh calls the vampires freaks, right in that first dialogue line. And then at the end, we have Lucas saying and thinking, I want to go home too. The night feels sour now, as if the joke's on us and we're not in on it. If we wanted this tone to feel darker, it could have been something like, I let out a weary sigh, wishing I could escape to the safety of home. The night feels bitter now, as if a joke's been made at our expense and we're left in the dark. A bit more dramatic, right? And there's so much tonal shift in the phrase, as if the joke's on us and we're not in on it, versus as if a joke's being made at our expense and we're left in the dark. Roanhorse builds tension throughout this whole short story. Will the boys of Blood River show themselves, and what are they going to do? But she does it with a balancing, playful tone, and her word choice reflects it at every single turn. I highly recommend reading it. It's funny too because the boys, the vampires, also have a playful attitude about them. They do have a real sense of danger, but how Roanhorse describes them is kind of like this local teen gang who wants to initiate Lucas into their ranks, which I love because it again adds to this teen movie feel that the whole short story has. So these are just some examples of how much tone can impact our writing voice and the story as a whole. This was seriously only on the first 2 pages of the short story. I could go into so much more detail. Let's now look at the opening to another short story in the collection titled The House of Black Sapphires by Danielle Clayton. Now, let's do this a little bit differently. I'm not going to tell you what this short story is about, and I'm not going to tell you my tonal words yet. So before I tell you what I feel like the tone is, I'd love for you to just listen and think of some tonal words. Okay? Let's jump into it. They said the Turner women of the House of Black Sapphires were a little strange, that they were just too beautiful, that they were up to no good. They said the Turner women were vampires, and whenever that word appeared, it was time to go. The Turner Firebird would start the morning song from its window perch. It knew when too many were watching, whispering, and surveying the beautiful black women who floated in and out of the peculiar apothecary-turned house, their ever-moving coffin of sorts. Bee hated the word vampire, and whenever they arrived in a new city, just like now, she braced for it, for all the other immortal folks to lump them together when they were decidedly not the same. Her entire family and their 13 trunks clogged the mahogany seats of a New Orleans streetcar. Mama had said they were headed to the Eternal Ward, one of the 5 versions of the city run exclusively by those like them. That this was home, one Bee had never seen before, one Mama wasn't sure she ever wanted to see again. But as Bee looked around at all the humans scrambling about, she thought everything seemed normal here. The perfume of the mortals' sweaty skin and the sound of their beating hearts made Bee's serrated tongue flare. She was eager to feed after such a long journey. As they snaked down Canal Street, a sticky breeze clung to her, and she couldn't fathom that they were headed to a beautiful, stilted version of this place. Okay, so any tonal words come to mind? For me, the tone of this excerpt is kind of eerie and unsettling, but it's really coded in this sense of otherness and anticipation. You know, I think Clayton does a good job of blending this sense of curiosity that we have alongside tension, particularly through B's perspective, because we're kind of at like a close third here, as right in the first couple paragraphs, she navigates the perceptions of her family and their identity without really giving the reader too much information. So my two words for this would be eerie and curious. Already the tonal shift is, I think, so evident from the previous short story, even though both of these are YA short stories about vampires. There's also evident difference in the author's voice as well. So what if we wanted to change this tone to the previous one we had, right? So change this opening paragraph to one with more anxiety and a playful attitude. So instead of saying, "They said the Turner women of the House of Black Sapphires were a little strange, that they were just too beautiful, that they were up to no good. They said the Turner women were vampires, and whenever that word appeared, it was time to go. The Turner Firebird would start the morning song from its window perch. It knew when too many were watching, whispering, and surveying the beautiful black women who floated in and out of the peculiar apothecary-turned house, their ever-moving coffin of sorts. You could say, they said the Turner women of the House of Black Sapphires were a bit off, that their beauty was unsettling, that they were up to something dark. Whispers followed them, and whenever the word vampire surfaced, it was a sign to leave. The firebird perched in their window would begin its mournful song, sensing the prying eyes and hushed gossip surrounding the striking black women who drifted in and out of the strange apothecary-turned home. It felt like a moving coffin sometimes." Do you feel how the tone shifted there? Right? So even just the last sentence, their ever-moving coffin of sorts. It felt like a moving coffin sometimes. It felt like a moving coffin sometimes has that playful tone, where their ever-moving coffin of sorts has more of an eerie tone. Did you also feel differently? I still felt intrigued because the concept of this story is so good, and I was still using a lot of Danielle Clayton's words, but when we're talking about this firebird that plays a part in the short story, it's like the family's bird that will signal to them when people are talking too much, right? Clayton sets it up in a way where, I don't know, she makes the firebird feel eerie, right? So she says, the Turner Firebird would start the morning song from its window perch. It knew when too many were watching, whispering, and surveying. Kind of eerie, right? Like the bird knows a lot of things, okay? And then we're curious. We're curious about it as well. Whereas saying something like the firebird perched in their window, sensing the prying eyes and hushed gossip surrounding them, is less eerie, a little bit more anxious. You know, they're sensing the prying eyes and hushed gossip. Those are more anxious words that, you know, in Roan Horse's short story, I talk about how the silence rushes in. You know, in this example, I used hushed gossip, prying eyes. These are just more anxiety-induced words, whereas that was not the tone that Clayton was going for, obviously, right? Her piece is more moody, more eerie, and it also has a sense of like sophistication because it's a period piece in New Orleans. Like we get the setting pretty clear once Clayton says their 13 trunks clogged the mahogany seats of a New Orleans streetcar. It falls in line with what the short story is about. This short story is about our main character, B, who kind of starts to tempt fate because she's interested in let's just say a man she shouldn't be, okay? So it goes along with the eerie and curious tone. B is curious. We as readers are curious. The information to us is slowly revealed, and we're kind of grasping at more, understanding their world more, and everything has this eerie, unsettling feeling, which really goes well with what the short story is about. Whereas in the previous short story with Rebecca Roanhorse, it has that more playful, anxious tone of that teen horror movie, and that's exactly what the short story is kind of about. That's how it feels. So the tone is relating to what you're writing about. It also is relating to how you want the reader to feel. And since tone comes down to word choice, effectively, and sentence structure, tone is going to affect your writer's voice. For the ending of this episode, I invite you to take part in this exercise as well. So pick a short story, just like I did, either one from this collection of Vampires Never Get Old, which is available on Kindle Unlimited if you have it, or pick a different short story. And then follow these steps. First, identify its tone, breaking it down into 1 to 3 words. Then, pick a new tone that you want to try and try to rewrite a sentence or paragraph with that new tone in mind. And then last, just reflect on it. Maybe, write a little journal entry about it and reflect on the word choice that the author chose and then the word choice you chose based on the tone. Reflect on how that word choice changed and reflect on how each piece made you feel. So this is kind of like a second step further from the exercise I asked you to do last time, which was to recreate a sentence or paragraph from an author and rewrite it in your own writing voice. This is rewriting it with a completely different tone. So you can keep their voice, but I do feel like when doing this, it kind of naturally turns into your voice as well, since voice and tone are different. I don't want you to think that they're the same thing, but they very much are intertwined. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I hope you had a great time. I hope you learned something or it made you reflect on your own writing in some way. And I hope you're inspired to go listen to some spooky stories. I know I am. I'm actually recording this right now with like a blanket over my head and to kind of create like a fake sound booth. And it's kind of funny because when I was reading these excerpts, I instantly got a little scared because I'm a scaredy cat who does not watch teen horror movies or really any horror movies of any kind. But I do love me some spooky goodness. I hope you all have a great rest of your week, a great spooky season, and if you're listening in real time, check out our next episode, which will be with Rachel Kitch, who is a horror author, as we continue our spooky season month. Until next time, bye, writers!